Welcome to Conversations with Melissa. This is a RenaFi program. I'm going to say a little thank you to RenaFi. RenaFi provides research-based practical education. At RenaFi, we teach about the underlying drivers of our behavior. That knowledge leads to better decisions, and better decisions lead to an improved quality of life. Visit renafi.com. Welcome, Beth. So, I only really met Beth in the last few weeks, but I had seen her presentation at last year's ADHD conference, and you can look around the world a lot for information about RSD, and there'll be a lot of MDs and practitioners sharing about RSD, but not a lot of people who are speaking from a first person perspective. And so that is what I really appreciate. Beth brings a different way of thinking about it, because she's coming to it as a person who's, this is her lived experience. And so I'm very grateful to have you here to share about rejection sensitivity, a topic that's really gaining a lot of interest recently. All right, without further ado, Beth, thank you again for being here on a Sunday, and welcome to Conversations with Melissa.
Wow, I really have enjoyed learning about your community and just getting ready to talk with everybody. I mean, RSD is a tough topic, and I guess the easy part of it is that when you're talking with other folks who have RSD, then all of a sudden there's this huge connection, almost at an intimate level, because of the tough type of feelings and emotions and experiences that go with it. And when we find out that it's been going on all of our life, it kind of helps make us not feel quite so crazy. Lots of reasons to feel crazy, but this isn't one of them.
So true.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's one of those things where I always, until I understood what RSD was, I always felt justified. I might feel crazy later, but in the moment I felt justified because this was a serious thing this person just did. I didn't understand why it was so serious for me.
One thing that I really appreciated from your presentation that you did at the conference, as well as the materials that you have here to share, which is that word outsized. Can you talk about how you came to use that language? When we hear professionals talking about it, that word stood out as how you were naming it was really distinct.
Yeah, I wanted to be able to find a way, because even just talking about my RSD experiences kind of gave me this recursive, almost ironic RSD response, right? Right, because I was feeling shame about it, and a lot of the terminology that gets used in the mental health circles by practitioners feels really judgmental, and it feels it's always kind of like putting us back on our heels and making us have to defend. And when I started looking at the why, what I saw was I was married for 25 years to a person with autism, and I saw his behavior a certain way with my lens and my understanding. And I would think, well, if he really loved me, he wouldn't do this, right? Yeah. Well, I didn't understand autism at all. And what I was doing was basing my assessment of his behavior based on my frame of reference, my perception, my way of how, if I said those things, I would mean this. And so it came to me that when I saw many of the clinicians, physicians, researchers, academics, you name it, when they're talking about mental health cases, they don't have them. They can't relate, and they might have empathy in the best case, but they can't relate. They've never had the specific experience. And what they're doing is the same thing that I was doing with my ex-husband, which, well, if I love somebody, I would never say something so mean.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, that was my perception. And so what I realized is that when you are an observer, observing behavior, you don't have any other way to understand it. And that's when the whole lived experience research became important to me. And I started trying to neutralize any of the words. The one that bothered me the most is when, even with Dr. Dodson, and I think he walks on water, but he says perceived rejection.
Yeah.
Now that tells me that I'm not dealing in reality. That tells me that that my experience is not real, because it's just a perception. And that was damaging to me. And so that is when I started trying to come up with neutral, non-judgmental terminology to explain what we're going through.
I want you to know there's not a tremendous, but in the chat there is this relating to it, and that thing about perceived, and there's some words, there's some languaging when you're talking with prescribers, with service providers, mental health service providers, where there is this like non-compliance. There's this way of talking about the people that are being served that just doesn't feel personable. And it does tend to have some, I hear I feel judged when I hear non-compliant, there's none of the how hard it was on my end, even to be whatever level of compliance. So it just feels like a rubber stamp judgment.
Yeah, it's a lack of an ability to try to understand what the root cause is.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
As opposed to, let's just put a Band-Aid on it. Let's make the bad feeling stop now.
Yeah. And then I had seen, it might have been Dodson, but I don't remember who it was. It was an MD talking about RSD, and there was this list of whatever they thought the triggers were. And I know when I am triggered and it feels like as close to RSD as I feel, right? But is it that? Which I'm hoping we learn more from you to have more distinctions around. Is it that? It's like I'll feel bossed, and that was never in his list, right? Like,
yeah, it is. You're right. I mean, and that's a very common way, because when you're in that moment, there's the person sitting across from you can't help but be confused and have judgment because they've never experienced it before. So of course they're not getting it. That's part of it, is that getting to a point to where we have a way to articulate things that aren't our experience.
Yeah.
So that we can actually develop true empathy, true understanding, true support. But we can't if we're misreading the signals.
Let's go with your beach ball metaphor. Can we talk about that?
So I was when we have these big emotions, I do a lot of studying of the social emotional learning, and it's mostly for children. I know that they're starting to look at ways to introduce adults to it, but not really in an applied way. They're just trying to get adults to the point to where they can name emotions, right? I feel like people with ADHD, because we're typically fairly sensitive already, and we've been living with a lot of emotions all our life. We've had a, crash course in emotions and saying what our emotions are quite a bit. We're pretty good at it. But we also have been taught and socialized that the unpleasant emotions don't go well with other people. And when we have RSD, and the RSD is like a bottle rocket that shoots up really fast. Like we get that trigger and it's almost instantaneous, the response, whether or not we've been rejected or corrected or directed. And we have learned that if we emote that unpleasant feeling that we're having during an RSD episode, that's bad. It's bad, and it's not going to go well. It's not going to go well with our parents. It's not going to go well at work, and it's not going to go well in our relationships. And so because we're people pleasers, we push it down, and it's like pushing down a beach ball. But we do that, we push it down into the water, and it's hard. And the way that I think about emotions, especially the unpleasant ones, is that if we let the beach ball up a little bit so that it's right at the top of the water, we can actually give ourselves a hug. And because we're not using all of our strength to hold it down, if we can open the valve and let it out, it's enough to help distract us through some of the unpleasant feelings. Now, does it work all the time? I actually don't have a beach ball right now, but I'm going to get one. But I use that thought and I actually go through the motions of it. And then I will go through the motion of opening up the valve. And when that valve releases, I squeeze my make-believe beach ball and I let out the air.
Right. I'm just going to say it back to you, right? When we have these giant feelings, this big outsized feelings, sometimes we stuff those feelings. All right, I'm full of feeling, but I know I can't say it or be it in this space. So I'm just going to squish it, push it. And the feelings haven't diminished. They're still big, filling that ball, and they could still pop up and get away from our ability to control them. That's part of why this metaphor about the beach ball and the water. And then there's other ways to use the valve to deflate these feelings, to not negate that you're having them, but
no, they're real.
This is about self-care.
Yeah.
Right? It's about caring for ourselves.
The feelings that people with RSD, the feelings that we have, they are the same appropriate feelings for the same situations that neurotypical people have. Right? So, and they are on the positive side as well as the negative sides, but nobody goes to get help when they're having positive feelings, right? If things are going well, you're not suffering. But when you're suffering with the negative, unpleasant feelings, you're desperately trying to be understood. You're desperately trying to figure out how to avoid it, how to run away from it, how to clean up after it. And the feelings are exactly the same as a neurotypical person's. It's just that the scale is dialed up.
Let me get to the image you have that shows scales. Let's go there. There is a couple of questions that we're getting in the chat about overthinking, and then medicating. What do doctors use for medicating this? But I'm going to pull up that slide about scale, because I think that scale is important. This beach ball is an excellent metaphor for us, but how big is the beach ball, right?
Yeah.
What are we talking
Yeah.
about here? Is it,
Yeah.
is it the size of something we can move or not? All right, so I'm
Well,
going to
it
share screen.
depends. It really depends. I didn't realize until I started taking medication for my RSD that I was having RSD for some very unexpected things. I knew I was having RSD in my relationship, and I knew I was having RSD at work, but I didn't realize that I was having RSD when my passwords were being rejected. Because it's not anything that you tell anybody about. But I noticed after I started taking the medication that I stopped having that visceral reaction in me when my password was rejected. And I thought, oh,
Wow.
well, that's a rejection too, right? It's just, it's nothing that we would write home about.
You're saying about the frustration tolerance, right? With passwords, we can think that we're as frustrated as the next person. However, that's not really true, right? It is huge. You know, I've walked into the room where my husband's having some computer frustration, and he can't be any other place than there. I am the same. I'm not going to say this is him. This is me too. The computer frustrates you, and it's like it you know, ruined your breakfast cereal for the rest of time.
And it's okay to yell and swear at a computer.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I think it's the triggers that like context is everything, and triggers only really come from something that matter. This is my belief. I haven't studied anything. This is my belief, because there have been periods of time in my life when I didn't have true rejection issues because I was in scenarios where I didn't feel rejected, but I did feel corrected and I did feel directed, and those would light off the bottle rocket too.
Yes.
And so the relationship can matter. It's the context is everything, the environment, the power dynamic between you and the person causing the trigger.